Hey guys, great to be with you. Thank you for being here. Just quick show of hands. How many of you guys go to a public school? Quite a few. Okay. All right, good. Well, I'm going to talk about the public school system today because there's so much going on there that really is very different than what our forefathers would have learned at school. And I'm going to give you guys kind of an overview of this. Some of you who are in public schools, you're probably going to be like, yeah, well, I know that already. Duh, I'm there. For those of you who aren't, I think this will be useful as well. But today we were supposed to have overview of America, but Mr. Shurtleff asked me to fill in for Jack McManus, and I wanted a couple extra days to do that presentation. So we'll talk about what's going on in the public schools first, and how the enemies of our Constitution are trying to manipulate children into basically tearing down our country. And then Sun Tzu, we'll talk about this at the end, had a very, very wise saying, the old Chinese military strategist. He explained that you're going to lose every single battle if you don't know yourself and you don't know your enemy. And right now, the overwhelming majority of people in our country don't know who we are as a nation. They don't have an accurate understanding of our history, of our culture, of our heritage, of our forefathers, of our Constitution, of our Declaration of Independence, and they also don't understand the enemy, those who want to tear down our nation. And so we'll talk about education first, then we'll talk about the deep state, which is kind of like my catch-all term for the enemy that wants to destroy the United States and take away our freedom. And then finally on Wednesday, we'll do the overview of America. We'll learn some of our history and our heritage. Now, the polling data all by itself speaks volumes as to what's going on in the public school system. My generation, I'm a millennial, which is always really embarrassing to admit. I think I'm one generation above most of you guys. 70% of the people from my generation describe themselves, so 70% of my generation, they say that they're socialists. And it's actually a pretty remarkable thing because children are born naturally being capitalists. And I've got a 3-year-old, you guys might have seen him around here, and you can do this experiment with him. Take his stuffed animal or take something that belongs to him, and he'll say, give me that, that's mine, right? So my 3-year-old understands private property. Nobody had to teach him that he has private property rights, that his stuffed animal is his, and yet 70% of my generation will tell you that they are socialists. And of course, socialists want to abolish our system of private property. Does anybody know, by the way, who ordained private property? Very good, right? Thou shalt not steal. Pretty clear, right? And of course, you can't steal something unless you have a right to property. And so God is the one who ordained private property, and as we'll see when we look at overview of America, private property is really fundamental to who we are as a people, and it's fundamental to having a successful society. If you go to the nations where they do not respect private property rights, places like Cuba, places like North Korea, places like Venezuela, places like Vietnam, places like the former Soviet Union, you'll come to realize very quickly how important private property is. What happens when you don't have a system of private property is everybody ends up very, very poor, except the ruling communist elites or socialist elites. And this graph here, 70% of my generation being socialist, that should be very alarming to all of us because these are the future voters, these are the future CEOs, these are the future political leaders, and we are not going to do well as a nation if this religious questions, the situation is equally troubling. Oh, okay, I just got to now share this properly. So on the religious front, you guys I'm sure all know that America was founded as a Christian nation. Oh, there we go, look at that. And you know, in our founding era, almost everybody was Christian. And even just, you know, a decade ago, something like 75, 80, 90% of Americans, depending on what poll you used, would say they were Christians. And yet today, my generation is the first generation in American history, millennials, where Christians are going to be in the minority. And so when Barack Hussein Obama said, whatever we once were, we're no longer a Christian nation, you know, I hate to agree with Obama on something, but he was kind of right. You know, that's the direction we're heading in. And again, this is actually a direct result of the indoctrination we're seeing in schools. And when you look at the polling data on whether people believe in God, you see the same trend. Only half of young Americans today would even say that they believe in God for sure. And this is another one of those things. You have to have a lot of indoctrination to make that happen. Children, they've done studies on this. Children all over the world, doesn't matter if their parents are Buddhists or Hindus or Shintos or atheists or Christians, children all over the world are born with an understanding that they were created by an all-powerful and loving entity. And you know, they can't quote Bible verses to you, but they have some general idea that a very powerful being created them. And again, this is true across cultures before children are exposed to anything having to do with religion. Now, there is a very concerted effort to try to separate our young people from their parents and from their grandparents. This is not a new idea. In fact, Adolf Hitler, I'm sure you guys have heard of that guy, right? National Socialist. He was wrong about pretty much everything, but he was right about one thing. And this is a real quote. It actually came up in the Nuremberg trials. He said, "He alone who owns the youth gains the future." Now here we have a lot of youth, and what we're going to see is that right now there is a concerted effort in our country as well, this is happening all over the world, to separate the youth from their parents and to get them on board with this wild agenda. And I'm going to show you just a couple of clips and stuff so you guys can see what I'm talking about. This is from MSNBC, one of the main cable news stations, talking about who should be in charge of child rearing. Let's see. Uh-oh. We passed it.
We have never invested as much in public education as we should have because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is...
I'm sorry guys, it's coming out the wrong speaker, so let me just fix that quick and we'll do it again. Here we go.
We have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the household, then we start making better investments.
All right, do you guys belong to the whole community? I hope not, right? Really, your parents should be the ones primarily in charge of your upbringing. But this is kind of the philosophy that is now running rampant in America. This idea that we should have the government take care of child rearing. And frankly, that's terrifying. If you know anything about history over the last 100 years, you know that all the governments that tried to take child rearing away from parents and put it in the hands of the state, they always ended up in mass atrocities, concentration camps, starvation, and other horrors. And yet now this is the philosophy that's coming into our nation as well. The federal government now actually has this as official policy. Back during the last year of the Obama administration, they put out a document. Oh, here we go again. I think we're going to need another HDMI cable, gentlemen, because this one doesn't seem to be working well. But the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education, they put out a policy document saying that parents could be equal partners in the raising of children, the other equal partner being the government. And if you actually read through these documents, you see that really they don't think parents will be the equal partners. They think parents will be the junior partners in this relationship. And they talk about we need mandatory home visits to check that parents are raising the children the way the government thinks they ought to be raised, and so on. Here we go. All right. Sorry for the technical difficulties, guys. Let's see if we can keep this moving. And now the Secretary of Education, until recently, Arne Duncan, he just came out and said it. We want some of these kids 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Watch this. This guy spent 7 years as Secretary of Education until Trump took office.
And there are certain kids we should have 24/7 to really create a safe environment and give them a chance. I think all of our schools should be community centers. Our schools should be open 12, 13, 14 hours a day with a wide variety of after school.
What do you think, guys? You guys want to live with the government 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? I hope not. Now, you know, they've been telling us this for quite a while. Hillary Clinton wrote a book saying that it takes a village to raise the children, right? And of course, if you read her book, it's not just any old village, it's the government village is going to raise the children. And this is what happens when the government village raises the children, right? You have children who have absolutely no understanding of our heritage, of our liberties, of our Constitution. You guys might remember these. You might not watch a lot of news, but there was a school shooting down in Florida, and these two geniuses here, they went on television and they said, oh, wait till we take over this democracy from our parents. We're going to take everybody's guns away, and then we won't have school shootings. Like, okay, in the 1930s, anybody your age could have gone to Sears catalog and ordered a fully automatic machine gun. Guess how many school shootings we had in the 1930s? None. Okay, so obviously the problem is not access to firearms, and we don't live in a democracy. We'll talk about that as we get to the overview of America. We live in a constitutional republic, and we should hope we could keep it that way. Now, there is an agenda that's being pushed in the schools. They are preparing for something, and we're going to get into much more detail on this when we go into the deep state, but I want to show you guys just a couple quick videos so you don't have to believe me that this is what they're preparing for. They will tell you themselves. Listen to these guys.
Before us, the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN Center.
So they're preparing a new world order where a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role, by which they mean its military role, to implement the vision of the UN's founders. Now, you might not have learned much about the UN's founders, and there's probably a very deliberate reason for that. The two really big ones, of course, the big superpowers that were involved were the U.S. government and the Soviet government. This was after World War II. Well, on the Soviet side, of course, they were led by the mass-murdering butcher Joseph Stalin, who slaughtered tens of millions of people. I mean, one of the most barbarous savages to ever walk on this planet. Then, on our side, we sent a guy that everybody loved him. It was crazy. His name was Alger Hiss. They liked him so much he got to be the chairman of the conference that came up with the UN Charter, and he got to be the first Secretary General of the United Nations, supposedly representing the United States. Well, we found out a few years later he was actually serving as a spy for said Joseph Stalin, so we put him in federal prison. So these are the founders of the UN, and he's telling us we're going to basically get rid of the vision of our founders and replace it with the vision of the UN's founders. That ought to be very alarming to us. And of course, it's not just a Republican problem, right? This was a Republican president, but Democrats think the same. Check this out.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
Yeah, so Biden, the candidate for 2020, agrees. And here is Bill Clinton.
In 1989, President Bush said, and to phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order.
And so this new world order that they're talking about, I'm going to show you how they're implementing it through the education of children in the schools. In fact, they brag that they're doing that. You don't have to take my word for it. But it's a totally different system than what we have here in America. In fact, the two are not just incompatible, they're fundamentally opposed to each other on every level. In America, as we're going to see when we get into the overview of America, our founding fathers enshrined certain truths in the Declaration of Independence. They said they were self-evident truths, that all men are created equal, that all of us are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that government exists to protect those rights. Well, if you look at the UN's version of rights, it's really exactly the opposite, right? You have privileges that the governments and these international agreements give you, but your privileges can be revoked at any time. And if you actually read the UN Declaration of Human Rights, you go down to Article 29, they tell you that none of your rights and freedoms may ever be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So it'd be like having our First Amendment. Yeah, you have free speech, but don't you dare make Congress mad or the Supreme Court or the President, in which case then you lose your right to free speech. That's the ideology that they're coming from. Now, if you really want to understand what this world order that they're talking about, that they're preparing our children for, looks like, just take everything God teaches in the Bible and just flip it 180 degrees upside down. So God teaches us that there are men and women. He created them male and female. And so now I'm going to show you guys, they're teaching our children that there's infinite genders. You can pick your gender. If you feel like you're the wrong gender, you can start taking hormones or maybe have surgery. This is the stuff they're teaching kids as young as kindergarten. Marriage, we know God created it as a man and a woman to raise children. And so what do they teach our children now? I'm going to show you guys how this happened starting back in the early 90s. I've got an incredible video of what they showed the children. Now they're teaching them that marriage could be whatever the Supreme Court says it is. It could be, 3 guys, 2 girls, and a cat, and we'll call that a marriage. God ordained private property. And so what do they teach our kids? Private property is at the root of social injustice. We've got to get rid of that. God created free markets. God ordained that there should be liberty. And so all these things are being wiped out. And they tell you how they're doing it. That's the amazing thing. I know some of you in this room are very familiar with Agenda 21. I know I was on Zoom calls with you guys. That was really exciting. And so Agenda 21 is a very serious international instrument that's being used to bring about this world order. And, if you watch too much CNN, you probably heard, it's just a conspiracy theory. Don't believe those conspiracy kooks. Agenda 21 is nothing. Well, here are some people talking about nothing.
The Climate Convention on the importance of economic instruments and free markets were included in this mammoth Agenda 21 document and the Rio Declaration.
So there's Bush talking about Agenda 21, and here's Nancy Pelosi, the leader of the Democrats in Congress.
The Earth Summit Environmental Leadership Act, as this is known, presents us with an opportunity to follow up on the important work of the Earth Summit to develop its blueprint, Agenda 21, for global environmental action. H. Res. 353 outlines a comprehensive national strategy for sustainable development in accordance with the principles of Agenda 21.
Anyway, she goes on. But are you guys starting to see here? It doesn't matter, Republican, Democrat, on the important things, they all agree. We need a new world order. Agenda 21's got to be implemented. And so I want to show you what they say about Agenda 21. This is a little summary that they put together. They said it proposes an array of actions intended to be implemented by every person on this planet. That's all of you and all your children and your grandchildren. It's going to require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. I mean, they're talking about huge these plans, right? They never asked us. We never voted on whether we wanted it. In fact, they didn't even ask our Senate if they would ratify it. They just said, we're going to implement it with executive orders and grants and agreements. Well, how are they going to do this, right? You guys remember Obama called us bitter clingers. They're clinging to our guns and our Bibles. We're the bitter clingers. They know that Americans, many of us, are bitter clingers. So what are they going to do about it? Well, they actually tell you. If you go to chapter 36 of Agenda 21, and you can read this right on their website, they tell you that education is going to be critical for promoting sustainable development. It's going to be indispensable, is the word they use. That's interesting. In other words, it is absolutely essential to their plan that, quote unquote, education be used to change people's attitudes. And there's going to have to be a lot of attitude changing, right? They say it's going to be critical to change the attitudes, behavior, and skills of people to be consistent with sustainable development. It's even got to include their spiritual development. And if you go to a public school, you probably heard, oh, separation of church and state, can't have any of that. I think we'll take questions at the end. Where's Mr. Shirtliff? Did he step out? Questions at the end. Okay, yeah, so we'll do that. And so they do have a spiritual component to this as well. Now, this is an Agenda 21 book for children produced by the United Nations. If you were a little younger, you might have seen this because it's a relatively recent book. Some of you might be young enough to have seen this in your schools. It's called Rescue Mission Planet Earth, a children's edition of Agenda 21. And how many of you guys know what God says about children? He says they're a blessing, right? He says we should be fruitful and multiply. So in other words, have kids, right? If you can. And what do they teach our children in this Agenda 21 for Children book? This is just one sample. But you see, the Hindu gods are up there, and they're very upset because all these babies are being delivered. And then you go to the next page, and it tells you why the Hindu gods are very upset. The earth groans every time it registers another birth. So what are they teaching our kids? Oh, don't be fruitful and multiply. That's terrible. That's going to be bad for Mother Earth, right? So on every single point, what God teaches is being contradicted by what they want to teach our children in the public schools and what they are teaching in the public schools. I actually went down to Rio de Janeiro in 2012 for the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, exactly 20 years after they signed Agenda 21, and they had conscripted a bunch of kids into making these kinds of posters. You see, the sick earth is sad, and the doctor diagnoses the problem. You have humans. Okay? You guys are the disease on this planet, but fortunately the UN is going to help us take care of that disease. And this is the attitude that they're instilling in our children. That is why we're seeing the things that we're seeing. Actually, I was very pleased to see President Donald Trump explain in his Independence Day speech that the reason for the mayhem in our streets is the anti-American indoctrination in the public school system. That is absolutely the truth, and these people outlined it all before. Now, they've also got Agenda 2030. It's a more recent agreement they signed in 2015. Obama signed it for the United States. Again, no Senate ratification. But they said children are critical agents of change. They're going to use this agenda to create a better world. And we know what the UN thinks of as a better world. In fact, you can just read Agenda 2030 and they tell you, right? Goal number 10, for example, is we're going to reduce inequality within and among countries. So national socialism, Hitler's variety of totalitarianism, wasn't adequate anymore. Now we need global, international socialism, right? We got to redistribute wealth all over the world. And of course, they're talking about taking it from the middle class in America and redistributing it to the dictators enslaving the third world. Now you keep going, they tell you again how they're going to do this. Goal number 4, by 2030, all learners, that's all of you, including if you're homeschooled, if you go to a Christian school, they want all learners, no exceptions, and we'll talk about that at the end. They need to be so brainwashed, they're going to promote sustainable development. It's not enough to just passively accept it or bend over and lie down and accept this. You got to promote it. That's how brainwashed you need to be. Now, Agenda 2030 obviously is a very, very significant document. The head of the UN at the time, Ban Ki-moon, called it the Global Declaration of Interdependence. The head of the UN General Assembly, which they're now calling the Parliament of Humanity, called it the Master Plan for Humanity. And they're actually producing videos now about how important the role of education is going to be in bringing this nightmarish vision that would completely cancel out our freedoms and our republic into being. Check this out.
We achieve sustainable development that protects our planet and builds a more inclusive, equal, and peaceful world without education. We can't. Sustainable development begins with education. Put global education first.
So that's where they're going with it, right? And they've got a lot of practice now. They've been manipulating us through the public school system for a very long time. And I'm going to show you just one really obvious example. This was during my generation. I was in elementary school during the early 1990s. And back then, sodomy was still a crime. I mean, it just would have been unthinkable that we'd be having something called a homosexual marriage within a generation. But they prepared the children in advance. I'm actually going to show you guys a video clip from a video they showed children all across America in the early 1990s, first grade, second grade, and third grade, getting them ready for this monumental change that was going to be brought about. Watch this.
Let me tell you quickly the background. Today, the law says that if you're the same sex, 2 men and 2 women, you can't get married. It is against the law. And I thought that it might be kind of fun for us to sort of be pretend judges for a few minutes. What I'm going to give each of you is a sheet that just tells you that some people think that it's wrong for gays to get married, that it's not natural, and that it goes against what a family is. Other people think that the state should not decide these things, that it should just be up to 2 adults to decide what they want to do. What do you think the answer to these questions are? Should gays be allowed to marry? Should they not?
So did you notice what they said? Let's be pretend judges, okay? So they actually tried to do this on the ballot. I mean, they went to California and they said, voters, what do you guys think? Should we have homosexual marriage? They're like, no. Not even in California, right? One of the most liberal of all our states. The voters said no. But what had they done? They had prepared an entire generation of young people in advance to think of themselves as pretend judges who could then go and strike down marriage laws in all 50 states, completely contradicting God's definition of marriage. Now, nowadays we see, well, you don't see, but now we see, teachers' unions and government schools marching in pride parades. Let's see if we can get this back up again. Just incredible stuff in our streets. And all of it, of course, is a direct result of what happened in the public school system. All right, here we go. Got it again. And now I want to show you just for a minute what they're teaching the kids today, which, if you're from my generation, you still remember learning that carbon dioxide was this really important gas and that humans exhaled it and then plants used it for photosynthesis, and it's just this beautiful cycle that exists. And, in fact, if anything, the Earth is starving for more CO2. Well, today, they are teaching the kids in public schools all across America and all over the world that carbon dioxide is actually a pollutant. Right? The gas you exhale, about 2 pounds of it every day comes out of your mouth, is pollution. Okay, and so from a scientific perspective, you're going to hear from Dr. Willie soon later, this is really rather silly. But from a totalitarian perspective, if you want to control everything that people do, it is absolutely brilliant, right? Because there's nothing you can do that doesn't release CO2. You can't eat, you can't sleep, you can't get up off the couch, you can't turn on a light switch, you can't start your car, you can't even die without CO2 being released into the atmosphere, right? And that's okay, because the plants use it, and it's wonderful. The more CO2, the bigger the plants, the more agricultural yields we'll have. But now they are teaching the kids that this is pollution, and that the only answer to this alleged pollution, this crisis, is to pay a tax and to submit to global regulations on this alleged pollution. So you can imagine what the implications are going to be. Now check out these videos. Here's one that the UN produced.
We hope that as many schools as possible will follow examples like this, and we will support them in their efforts. Education is a powerful tool to address climate change and to ensure that the rights and needs of people today and tomorrow can be met. Let us use it and get active today.
So yeah, education is going to solve climate change, right? Because the climate's been changing literally from the time the planet was put here. And in fact, the Vikings who used to farm on Greenland 1,000 years ago can tell you all about it. It used to be warm enough to farm there. Today, you would freeze your patoot off and you couldn't farm anything because it's freezing, right? It's just the climate changes. Here's what it looks like in a classroom.
It's our fault, and the consequences will be terrible. Children are frightened.
I worry. My mom worries the water might rise and it might flood the whole town.
We won't be able to survive for long.
What are you most worried will happen?
We'll all die.
Are there some people who say this isn't true?
Yes.
Might they be right?
No.
How do you know they're not right?
Well, because the earth is getting hotter.
Where do you learn this?
It's like a cult, right? A doomsday cult. Now they give them letters to sign for their congressmen, right?
Students of global warming, that they're given a letter for their families to sign, and this is a congressman or woman.
So yeah, they brainwash the kids, and then they give them letters to sign for their congressman, and then what happens? Congressman thinks, oh my goodness, everybody's really concerned about global warming. I guess I better sign up for a global tax on the gas we exhale, okay? And it sounds ridiculous, and yet this is exactly where this is going. You know, the older generations of Americans know that the idea that CO2 is pollution is kind of silly. They've done the polling data. They know that the majority of Americans who are older reject that idea, but they also know that they've now brainwashed an entire generation of young people in the public school system to believe we're going to die from carbon dioxide. And so give it a generation and they'll get their way. Now, my friend Charlotte Iserbyt, I'm going to show you a video with her in just a moment. She actually served as a senior advisor to Ronald Reagan on education. And what she figured out was they were merging the American public school system with the Soviet system. In fact, they were bringing these crazy ideas from the Soviet Union, which slaughtered 50 million to 80 million people over to the United States and implementing them in our schools. And so she tried to blow the whistle. She got the documents and leaked them. And here's what she says is going on in the schools.
You think the purpose of education is reading, writing, and arithmetic? The purpose of education is to change the thoughts, actions, and feelings of students.
And so she was opposed to that. Now here is Dr. Shirley McCoon. She was actually on contract with the U.S. Department of Education to create national standards for education before we even knew we were going to have national standards. This was in the late 80s into the early 90s. Now listen to what she says is the purpose of education.
Fix up these schools and taking care of them, rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society.
So a total restructuring of our society. Now listen to how it's going to be brought about.
The other function of schools, which sounds paradoxical and yet in a sense is really not, is the fact that we have to prepare students not for today's society, but for a society that's 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And so we have to anticipate what the future is.
They use their crystal ball for that part, right?
And figure out what it is we need to do today. That's called anticipatory socialization, or the social change function of school.
The social change function of school. So your average American parent who sends their children off to a public school doesn't think, hey, I'm going to send my kids off so they can be socially changed and we can fundamentally transform our whole society. They just think, hey, they're going to learn how to read, write, do math, that stuff. Unfortunately, that is not what's going on, and I'll show you the data in a moment. That same lady we just saw, Dr. Shirley McCoon, she's also an occultist. She was involved in, she was one of the co-authors of this book, The Light Shall Set You Free. They were communicating with these, they call them ascended masters, these spiritual entities that would help channel this stuff, and they're talking about this new world order, this fifth dimension. Absolutely crazy stuff. Now, what does this fundamental transformation look like? Well, we're starting to see what that looks like in the school. So take Minnesota, for example. There was a child who believed that he had been born in the wrong body, that he was actually a girl who had accidentally been born in the wrong body. Asked his parents if he could have a so-called sex change, and the parents said, absolutely positively not. Get back to school, please. Well, the school took this child to go have surgery under the guise of what they call a sex change, and now there's a federal lawsuit about it. This was an underage child, but hey, there's nothing you can do, right? The pieces parts were removed, and nothing you can do. In California, I actually pulled this screenshot right here, right off the Department of Education's website. They've got what they call a gender transition plan and an individual support plan. So if a child feels like he or she might have been born in a wrong body or a different gender, they will start this child on hormones. They will give this child a new name. They will hide it all from the parents if the parents are not supportive. If you had told people this was coming even just a few years ago, people would have laughed. People would have said, that's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. Well, here it is on the Department of Education's website in California. And it's going to get crazier, a whole lot crazier before it gets better. This is a book that the new California health standards recommend for 5-year-old children. It's called Who Are You? The Kid's Guide to Gender Identity. They're telling kindergarten children that you might have been born in the wrong body. We used to believe that there was just male and female. Now we know that there are infinite genders. They give the kids 15 different ones they could choose from. Agender, bigender, trigender, nous, trois, free spirit. If you feel like you need puberty blockers, they'll hook you up. This is where this is all going. And again, these are little children, right? I mean, these are kids who are smaller than some of my children. It's unthinkable. This is the Drag Queen Story Hour. They're doing this in public school libraries and public schools all over the country. They're bringing men in dressed up as women. This one here nicely wore a demon horn so we would know where he came from. This is actually at the Michelle Obama Library. And it's working. Okay, guys? It's working. The UCLA, the University of California in Los Angeles, did a study last year, and they interviewed, I forget how many thousands of children in California, ages 12 to 17. A full 27% of them identified as gender non-conforming. So boys who don't accept they're boys or girls who don't accept that they're girls. Now, I was a kid not all that long ago. In the early 1990s, I was in elementary school, and I lived on like 8 countries on 4 continents. I grew up with kids from every culture you could possibly imagine, and throughout my entire childhood, I never once met a gender non-conforming kid. I never met a girl who thought she was a boy. In fact, the word transgender wasn't even in the dictionary when I was a kid in the 80s, in the 90s, and into the early 2000s. And yet now, according to the UCLA, 27% of California's children. This I got from Utah, because I get parents like, well, I live in South Carolina. That doesn't apply in my state. Yes, it does. This I got from Utah. I was there in March, and I had an opportunity to meet with some of their education officials. This is the data that they got from the Department of Professional Licensing and Regulation. There has been a 10,000% increase in 5 years in the number of girls undergoing what they call a medical transition to a new gender. Okay, 10,000% increase. It's exponential. Now, it's even getting crazier, and I hesitated to even show you guys this, but at some point you're going to run into this anyway. This is a video that was sent to me by a mother in California. She found out, and she actually sent me the curriculum they were using. They were teaching her kids. In California, they got this new law that you have to teach the history of LGBT, whatever. And so this mom sent me the curriculum. It goes through Harvey Milk, the child rapist who ended up as the supervisor, one of the supervisors in San Francisco, and then he was murdered by a Democrat. So it starts with him, and then they go through and they say, oh, in ancient Greeks, yeah, they used to do pedophilia. Grown people would have relations with children. And so the mom says, what, you're teaching this to my kids? So she goes to the meeting. This is the assistant superintendent of curricula for this school district. And listen to what she says when the mom confronts her. Yeah, so it's a sexual orientation that's occurred in history. So, of course we got to teach it to your kids. Well, I can think of a lot of things that occurred in history that they're not teaching the kids. I mean, Jesus walked on this planet, right? That'd be a good place to start. Can't say that, even though that's a documented fact. But we can teach them that adults had lots of relations with children because, hey, LGBT curriculum. And it gets crazier, right? This is a school in California. A student took a picture. It says pedophilia as a sexual orientation. Well, in California and 26 other states, it's now against the law to so-called discriminate based on sexual orientation. And here they are teaching a whole generation of children that attraction to children is a sexual orientation. Well, do the math and you can figure out where this is going, right? The UN Education Agency, they have this new global standards for sex education. They want to start the sex ed at 5 years old, things that we can't even mention in polite company. I mean, if somebody taught that to any of my kids, there would be a big problem. And it's all based on this guy. We're not going to get into too much detail, but I encourage you as you get older to research this. All this idea that kids need a lot of sex education in school, it comes from the research of this guy here, Alfred Kinsey, one of the sickest men that I can think of to have ever walked on this planet. He did so-called sex research and came up with this idea that children are actually sexual beings from birth, and so they need to be educated in sex ed from the time they're in kindergarten. This is monstrous. This is, in my opinion, an enormous crime. It was actually fraudulent research anyway. We won't go too deep into it, but all this idea that kids need to be exposed to this stuff in school, it all comes from this guy, a psychopath who actually died and engaged in some very weird things. Now, we have Common Core. The National Education Standards, just to give you a sense of how bad they are, if you've experienced them, you probably already know, they only had 2 subject matter experts on the Common Core Validation Committee. I know both of them. They're very nice. This is one, Sandra Stotsky. She's an English professor, and she said she would refuse to sign off on these standards. She said they're going to reduce the critical thinking abilities of children. You're taking out all the good literature. This is not how children learn how to read. No, I'm not going to do it. So she refused. Here's the math expert. He also refused, Dr. James Milgram, a mathematician at Stanford. He said these are written to reflect very low expectations. They have extremely serious failings. They're as non-challenging as possible. There are actual errors in the math, okay? They are neither mathematically correct nor especially clear. And so we're going to make sure every child in the public schools in America learns from this. In fact, he said if you expose a child to this Common Core math for more than a couple of years, they may never recover, right? They may never become decent at mathematics. And now apparently math is even racist, if you believe the people in Seattle at running the school system there. So I don't know how we're going to build bridges without racist math, how we're going to put airplanes in the sky, but this is where this is going, right? They are dumbing down an entire generation of American children. Now, the government knows these standards are dumbing down the children. They actually did a study, just came out last year. They found that there were significant negative effects as a result of Common Core in both English and math. So they know this is harming children, and yet it's still there. They also created the next generation pseudoscience standards, same people who brought you Common Core. They will, I mean, get this, in 12 years of government school, right, first grade through 12th grade, you will never hear the term scientific method under the next generation standards, okay? You would think that'd be like the most basic thing to learn in a science class. Well, not under the next generation pseudoscience standards. Instead, you'll learn that global warming is going to kill us all unless we give the UN a tax, and you all came from slime that somehow turned into a monkey that came alive over billions of years and there is no God. That is your science lesson for you right there. Now, you're also learning fake history. Dr. Duke Pesta, who I'm working with closely, he's been doing surveys of his students every year. He says now 80%, he's a university professor, 80% of the kids coming into his class believe that America invented slavery. Okay? Perhaps not realizing that slavery has been ubiquitous from the dawn of human history, and the principles that America enshrined in our Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, actually laid the foundation for ending it, not just here, but all over the world. Okay? So the kids have it exactly backwards, and that's deliberate. That's why there's children, there's young people out there wanting to burn down our society. They'll learn that the Second Amendment, so the government can have a militia. They'll learn that Trump was a racist, way too extreme. Can't believe all these racist Americans voted for him to be president. They'll go to field trips to bow down to Allah, the moon deity of Islam. Here's the 5 pillars of Islam on the wall in a school in Kansas. Here's a document by the U.S. Department of Education, how to get rid of Christian privilege in the schools. They say, well, you can infuse the curriculum with intellectual traditions from the Muslim world. That's a good way to get rid of Christian privilege. You can do all kinds of Buddhism in the class. They call it mindfulness education, and they'll admit that this is Buddhist. You can do Hinduism in the class. You can do yoga, but you can't mention the 10 Commandments. You cannot mention the Lord's Prayer. You cannot mention the Bible. And in North Carolina, we found out they were forcing the little kids to stand up in the front of the class and apologize for their Christian privilege, okay? They've got data gathering and data mining. They are spying on your kids. They have more data on you and your children than you do. They're going to use it. They actually tell you, I got this right out of a Department of Education report, to create models for predicting future behavior and interests. So they're going to get all this data on you, and then they'll tell you what kind of job you'd be good for, what you're going to be interested in. Oh, you're a Christian? Oh, you believe in America? Okay, well, no, you don't get to be a lawyer. No, you don't get to be a teacher or a professor or anything like that. They've got values clarification. This was used on me when I was a child. And another person in the audience as well. Some of you guys, if you've been to public schools or even some private schools, you've probably had this. And the way they did it to me, I remember it like it was yesterday. They said, all right, everybody, you're in a boat and the ship is sinking and you're all going to pile into the life raft, but now there's 10 of you in the life raft, but there's only space for 9 of you. So who are you going to get rid of to make sure you can all survive? And they'd say you've got a doctor, you've got a teacher, you've got a lawyer, and of course the correct answer is the lawyer, right? Throw him right over there. Just kidding. I encourage you to come to the Lawyers for Liberty talk later today. That's going to be good. We need lawyers for liberty. We absolutely do. But so, if the kids were thinking, they'd say, well, wait a minute. Why do we have to kill somebody? Why, we just take turns, all swim alongside the raft for half an hour, then you swim, and then nobody has to die. We'll just wait to get rescued. But no, what they're supposed to think is, oh, look at this. My parents said thou shalt not kill. And the Bible said, and the pastor said, but here we have to kill. That's the only moral solution. So what do the kids think? The ethics and morality is based on the situation you're in. Maybe there is a time and a place to do atrocities, to put people in camps, to kill babies, to get rid of old people. Pick your horrifying thing. And this is very powerful. They actually say that this can undo 15 years of a parent raising their child just with this one exercise, because it suddenly flips a switch in the kid's mind. Oh my goodness, my parents were wrong. sometimes we do need to kill people, right? And it's a very, very deliberate effort. The UN now promotes it around the world. And I mentioned that the kids were not getting anything remotely resembling an education. You don't have to believe me about it. The government will tell you. This is their own data. Rather than just look at the data, let's listen to the Deputy Secretary of Education.
The National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, which is called America's Report Card, reports that two-thirds, get this, two-thirds of American 8th graders are not proficient in any core subject.
Can you imagine that? We're spending like $15,000 a year per child. They're spending 5 days a week, 7 hours a day in a government school classroom, and more than two-thirds of American 8th graders are not proficient in anything. Okay, and by proficient, I don't mean they're masters, right? I mean they can do basics, and by basics, it's significantly dumbed down from where it was. Now, it's been getting bad for a long time. Ronald Reagan put together a commission back in the early 1980s, and they found that this educational disaster threatens our future as a nation and as a people. They said if an unfriendly foreign power had done this to us, we would have viewed it as an act of war, and we should. We went from being the most highly educated society on the planet, the most literate society on the planet, to being down at the bottom of the barrel now if you look at the international rankings. John Adams said a native of America who can't read or write is as rare as a comet or an earthquake. He wrote in a letter to a friend. Go read the Federalist Papers, right? And then go find yourself some college-educated kids today who can understand that. The reality is most of them can't. We have a lot of studies on literacy from back in those times. This guy DuPont de Nemours did one in 1812. He found that not more than 4 in 1,000 young Americans were unable to write legibly, even neatly. And I can confess that I can't write legibly, and I bet there's more than 4 people in this room who can't. So we're going to run out of time way before we get to the end of this, but I'll try to go as quick as I can. Now, Alexis de Tocqueville, he was a Frenchman who came over here in the early to mid-1800s and looked at America, and he was amazed. He said every citizen receives the elementary notions of human knowledge. He's taught the doctrines and evidences of his religion, the history of his country, the leading features of its constitution. He says a person wholly ignorant of them is a sort of phenomenon. Right? Today, if you find somebody who knows the history of their country, the doctrines and evidences of their religion, the principles in the Constitution, that's a phenomenon, right? It's exactly backwards from where we were. And yet now we're spending $1 trillion a year on so-called education, and we're dumber than we've ever been in our whole entire history. How could that possibly be? Right? Well, it's by design. Even back in the 1600s, our founders were very clear. This was in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the first education act we ever got in North America. It was called the Old Deluder Satan Act. They said everybody needs to learn how to read, because if you can't read, you can't read the Bible, and if you don't know the Bible, Satan will deceive you. And so they said we need to make sure everybody is reading. Well, what happened today? If you look at the government's literacy data, something like half of adult Americans are either illiterate or so close to it that they'll never, ever open a book, they'll never read their Constitution, and that's the federal government's own data. Now, we've only got about 4 minutes left here, so I'll give you a very abbreviated version of the history of the public school system. Believe it or not, we didn't always have a public school system. In fact, for hundreds of years in North America, we had a mixture of church schools and homeschooling and private academies in a free market system. And that is what produced the generation that founded America, that wrote our Constitution, that wrote our Declaration of Independence. It wasn't until the early 1800s that anybody even seriously proposed having government schools. It was this guy here, Robert Owen. He was a communist before communism was cool, before Karl Marx came along. He started a colony up in Indiana called New Harmony, a total failure. And then when it failed, he said, the reason it failed is not because communism is ridiculous and private property is important. It's because we didn't get to brainwash the kids from the time they were tiny. So what we need is a government school system. Well, his idea caught on with the ruler of Prussia, and the ruler of Prussia decided to set up a government school based on his ideas. And this guy here, Orestes Brownson, he actually was he was one of the disciples of this Robert Owen, and he blew the whistle. He explained that what was really going on here was an effort to get rid of Christianity. They wanted to create a system of government schools so they could wipe away the Christian foundations of this nation. They formed a secret society for that purpose, modeled on the Carbonari of Europe. and their goal was to get men elected to the legislatures who would have the government take over the education system. Well, they finally succeeded in Massachusetts in the mid-1800s when Horace Mann became the first Secretary of Education. He was a socialist. He rejected the truth of the Bible. He wanted education to equalize all men, right? So we'll all be down at the same level. Sounds like Common Core. And he introduced this whole word quackery for teaching reading. It was a disaster. It was expelled from school within a couple years because everybody realized it didn't work. And we didn't hear from it again for another 50 years. And so John Dewey then came along. He sees this machinery that Horace Mann had laid down, this government education system, and he actually went to the Soviet Union for his inspiration. He loved what the Soviets were doing, and he actually wrote about it very extensively. He wrote a whole series of articles in the New Republic, said how great it is that the Soviets were instilling a collectivistic mentality in the children through the schools, and he wanted to do that in America. So he got money from the Rockefellers. He admitted that it would have to be a slow, gradual process, otherwise parents and teachers would freak out. He resurrected this whole word quackery to teach reading that we knew didn't work back in the 1840s. It didn't work any better in the early 1900s. In fact, that is the reason why we have so much illiteracy today. It's been exposed numerous times, and it's still being used under Common Core, right? The kids are supposed to read high-frequency words by sight. They're supposed to be studying sight words. Now, if you talk to anybody with an education degree in America from any state college, they'll say, oh yeah, John Dewey, he's the founding father of America's public education system. And I think in fairness, Horace Mann and Robert Owen deserve a lot of the blame, but John Dewey really is, in a very real sense, the founding father of our public education system. And so it's important to know what he had to say. And thankfully, he left us huge amounts of his writings explaining exactly what he believed, exactly what he wanted to use the public school system for. And so I'm going to share a little bit of that with you. And obviously you can't understand a person without knowing what their religious views are, because that colors their worldview. Everything they see, everything they understand in the world, they understand through the context of their religion. So I want to talk a little bit about John Dewey's religion. He was a very religious person, contrary to the popular narrative. He was actually one of the co-authors and one of the signers of the first Humanist Manifesto. So we can get it pulled up here. There we go. And so they actually called themselves religious humanists. Today they'll tell you, oh, we're just secular, we're just neutral, we just don't agree with any of your religions. But really, the early humanists acknowledged that they were a religion. And these are direct quotes from their Humanist Manifesto. The very first tenet is, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. And if any of you have opened your Bible to the very first page, you know that that is a direct assault on the very first words in God's Word. In the beginning, God created. So he was very strategic in terms of this religious document in coming out right away and trying to undermine the very first words in Scripture. Now, even for non-religious people, even for just Americans who love liberty, our nation was founded on what our founding fathers said was a self-evident truth that all of us were created, and that God endowed us all with inalienable rights. Well, what happens if you believe John Dewey's religion? There is no creator. The universe is self-existing. It's always been here. How could you possibly have God-given rights if there is no God? Right? So Dewey understood all this. Again, he went to the Soviet Union for inspiration. And remember, our founding fathers did not believe that the idea of a creator was a religious argument. In fact, they said in the Declaration of Independence, it's a self-evident truth. It's not something that we debate. It's just obvious. Anybody can see, as Romans 1 tells us, God made his attributes plain for all of us to see. We have to deliberately suppress the truth in our unrighteousness if we want to believe something so foolish. Now, his cohorts, this guy here, C.F. Potter, was one of the other co-signers of the first Humanist Manifesto, and he understood, just like John Dewey, the way to get this religion out there. That would be through the public school system. He actually wrote a whole book on this, Humanism, a New Religion. See, they were open about it, the religious aspect back then. They said education, public schools, will be the most powerful ally of humanism. Every public school will be a school of humanism. What is your Sunday school going to do, teaching 1 hour of theistic classes every week versus 5 days of humanistic teachings? And the answer is obviously nothing. Right? Now, this religion is actually not a new religion. John Dewey and company portrayed it as a new religion, but it really wasn't. Humanism is this idea that man or woman is his or her own little God. We can decide for ourselves what's right and wrong. We are the ultimate arbiters of our destiny, and if we just reform humanity with good government schools, we'll have a utopia on earth. Actually, this is very much what Horace Mann believed as well. He thought that having government school systems would reduce 90% of the crimes being committed. Of course, he was wrong, right? We have far more crime today than we did back in the 1800s. But humanism treats man as God. And where have we heard this before? Oh yeah, Genesis 3:5, right? God knows that in the day ye eat thereof, then ye shall be as gods, right? You guys get to be your own little gods. You get to determine for yourself what is good and evil, and so there is no more need for a creator, right? This is an old religion going right back to the beginning. Incredibly, the Supreme Court actually established this as our national religion. And they force us to support it with our tax money and our children. So in 1962, the Supreme Court ruled that we couldn't have prayer. It was a lawsuit against the state of New York. It was a non-sectarian prayer. It was actually developed by Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. Nothing sectarian, just God, we acknowledge our dependence on Thee. We beg Your blessings on us, our parents, and our teachers, and our country. Amen. Supreme Court said, no. First Amendment, for 200 years, we've understood that the First Amendment doesn't ban prayer at school, but now we've changed our mind. And hey, Congress shall make no law. Same thing as the state of New York shall have no prayer in public school. Right? Then in 1963, they went even a step further. No more Bibles allowed in public school. You guys are all too young. Well, most of you are all too young to remember that there used to be prayer in public schools all over America, and there used to be Bible readings all over public schools in America. Well, in 1963, the Supreme Court said no more Bible. And again, they said First Amendment. Anybody read the First Amendment? I hope so, since we're at Camp Constitution. It says Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say anything about your local school district or the state of New York or the state of New Hampshire or any other state. In fact, when the First Amendment was written and ratified, most of the states had established churches. The idea that the Founding Fathers intended to ban prayer and Bible in a school or anywhere else would have been so ludicrous, I submit to you, they probably would have burned down this country before they would have ratified something that could be misinterpreted so badly. But that shows you how far dumbed down, how indoctrinated we had already become, that enough of the American people could say, oh yeah, First Amendment, I guess we can't have prayer in school anymore, and just meekly submit, right? It's a ludicrous constitutional argument, but it is what they said. Now, at least one justice on the Supreme Court in his dissent recognized what was going on here. He wrote in his dissent, refusal to permit religious exercises thus is seen not as the realization of a state of neutrality, but rather the establishment of a religion of secularism, or humanism, as John Dewey and his cohorts would have called it. Now, the Supreme Court just did, by the admission of one of the Supreme Court justices, exactly what Congress was prohibited from doing under the guise of upholding the First Amendment. They never could have gotten away with that if the American people had not been dumbed down and prepared in advance, just like we showed earlier with the LGBT homosexual marriage ruling, right? They prepared the children in advance, and then they make these outrageous rulings. Now, we talk about the nationalization of education with Common Core, and that's a real problem. It's true. But we are now moving very quickly toward the globalization of education, where children in America will learn the same wicked, anti-Christian, anti-American propaganda as children all over the world, and I have the proof. They've been on this mission for a long time. Right after World War II, they ratified the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is kind of like the UN's phony Bill of Rights, except it's all government-granted privileges that can be revoked at any time. And they tell you in Article 26, education must be compulsory, and it must further the activities of the UN. So if you, at your private school or in your home school, teach the children that the UN is this horrific gangster club, dictator club that ought to be dismantled and thrown on the ash heap of history, you're violating their human rights, according to the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that was back in the 1940s. It got worse. At the same time, they created UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and they were very blatant about what they were doing. This guy here was the first Secretary General. His name was Julian Huxley. He was a eugenicist. He was actually the president of the Eugenics Society. Like Hitler, he believed that we could breed more perfect people if we excluded certain genes from the gene pool, right? Total quackery. And he was also the president of the Humanist Association. Pretty amazing. They also believed, according to a pamphlet they put out, that schools must be used to combat family attitudes. Okay, and if you dig deeper into this humanist movement, what you'll find is that it's really communism wrapped up in a religious garb. If you go back and read the first Humanist Manifesto, we got to get rid of the profit motive. We have to get rid of private property. We have to have equitable ownership of the means of life, they called it. Marx would have called it the means of production. Same difference. Well, in 1990, all the governments of the world and all the dictators of the world got together in Jomtien in Thailand, and they created an agreement that basically all the children need to learn from the same standards, right? The same basic learning content required by all human beings. It's not a responsibility of the parents or the school board or the Supreme Court or Congress. It is a common and universal responsibility. So it's a UN responsibility is what they mean. And then they say in Article 5 that all children must be subjected to the same standards of learning. wonder what's so funny. You'll have to tell us later. And then 10 years later, they got another international agreement. This was the Dakar Framework for Action. They met in Senegal. They said all governments in the world must implement integrated strategies which recognize the need for changes in attitudes, values, and practices. Right? Who of us agreed that we were going to have our children have their attitudes changed? Right? None of us agreed to this. Most parents don't think this is what's going on when they send their children to school, and yet that's what's going on. Now here's the Secretary General of the UN at the time. This was in 2015 at a global summit on education. Check this out.
Education must do more than produce individuals who can read, write, and count. It must nurture global citizens who can rise to the challenges of the 21st century.
And again, you go ask parents, hey, why do you send your children to school? Well, so they can learn how to read, so they can learn how to do math, so they can maybe learn some history, maybe so they can get a good job. I submit to you that probably becoming good global citizens is very low on the list. In fact, my children, I don't want them to be good global citizens at all. In 2016, they met in Korea. They came up with a UN Global Action Plan, and they just came out of the closet. Now education has to shape the spirituality of the children, and I'll show you what that means in just a moment. This lady here, it's amazing how they always find communists and Islamists and totalitarians to run all these UN agencies. Irina Bokova was a longtime member of the Bulgarian Communist Party. Her father was on the Politburo there, one of the most murderous regimes in history relative to the size of the population. Out of a population of about 7 million, they slaughtered about 250,000 people. She served as the foreign minister for this regime. And naturally, they gave her a spot running the UN Education Agency. She hates me with a very special passion, which makes me smile. Right? And she said in a press release that was sent out to everyone on UNESCO's mailing list, we have the collective duty to empower every child with the right values to become good global citizens. Okay? Here's a UN video explaining what's going on here. Check it out.
The Education 2030 Agenda is our roadmap to inclusive and quality education for all. UNESCO, the UN specialized agency for education, is leading the global and regional coordination of this ambitious goal, responding to cutting-edge global challenges, supporting countries to build better education systems, and monitoring progress to make sure the world stays on course.
Okay, and I mean, with a British accent, you sound so sophisticated. How could you possibly disagree, right? But you heard her. The UN is supporting countries to build better education systems and monitoring progress to make sure the world stays on course. Okay, so Lord Monckton will bring in his fabulous British accent later for us. But I mean, that's what the UN is saying. And you know, your American looks at that and says, "Oh, but that's just for like third world countries, right? They're not helping us here, but we've got a perfectly adequate education system." Well, not according to this guy. We saw him earlier, Arnie Duncan. He spent 7 years as Obama's education secretary. He said UNESCO, the UN Education Agency, was the global partner of the U.S. government in turning children into green global citizens. He gave a speech to UNESCO. It's still on the Department of Education's website. He quoted a communist terrorist. I won't tell you which one because we'd need another presentation. But he said education is the most powerful weapon that you can use to change the world. He said education is a global public good unconstrained by national boundaries. Are you getting this? We now need a global education system. It's not enough to just have a national one. Now, they've been working on this for a very long time. This guy here, Robert Mueller, no relation to the special counsel as far as I know. He was the Assistant Secretary General of the UN, and he wrote something called the World Core Curriculum. And he said openly this should be taught in every school on the planet. He believed that national education systems were harmful and produced war because people learned about their own country and maybe not what other countries thought. So he created this World Core Curriculum, and he put together a teacher's manual for this. And you should get a copy at your local library. You can even find it on Google. In the foreword to the teacher's manual, which he wrote, he drops an amazing admission. Now, this is a direct quote from there. He says, the underlying philosophy upon which it's based will be found in the teachings set forth in the books of Alice Bailey by the Tibetan teacher, Jwal Khul. And I heard one person gasp because she must know who Alice Bailey was. Your average American, probably 99 out of 100 Americans, never heard of Alice Bailey, but everybody on the top floor of the UN headquarters building knows exactly who she is. I'll give you a hint. She was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. True story. True story. She designed the meditation room under the basement in the UN where they all go and they pray to their demon gods. Now, this Jwal Khul, the Tibetan, Turns out he's not Tibetan, he's not a teacher, and he's not even a human being. Alice Bailey claimed to be communicating with these spiritual entities she described as ascended masters. If you've read your Bible, you know these are not ascended masters of any kind. She would channel these things, and they would write these books through her. One of them, I mean, if the World Core curriculum is based on this lady's rantings and ravings, we ought to know what she says. Well, one of the books that she and her ascended masters wrote was called Education in the New Age. So let's see what they say about education. World citizenship should be the goal of the enlightened, with a world federation and a world brain, which takes on like a whole new meaning in the age of Google and getting microchips and smartphones in our pockets, right? They say that our problem is to attain the kind of overall synthesis that Marxism, that wonderful ideology, and neo-scholasticism provide for their followers, but to get this by the freely chosen cooperative methods that our good friend John Dewey, who we just learned about some more this morning, advocated. Okay, so that's what they're telling you. Okay. Now in 2015, UNESCO put out this report where they were bragging like, hey, when we started this global education thing, there was only like 3 countries in the whole world that had national education standards and tests. Now we're up to over 100. In America, we call that Common Core. And of course, they're being aligned to the international standards. Now, Bill Gates, everybody knows he put a lot of his own money into Common Core. He put about $2.3 billion to be precise. So after U.S. taxpayers, he was the largest single financier of Common Core. What less people know is that in 2004, he was over at UNESCO headquarters in Paris, signing an agreement with UNESCO on behalf of Microsoft to create global standards, global master curricula, global teacher training programs, global technological infrastructure for education. And this is all on paper. I mean, Phyllis Schlafly got a copy of the agreement and posted it online. You can read it for yourself. Now, I want to show you a commercial that the Common Core people produced themselves so that, again, you're not having to rely on me to understand what's going on here. So this is a Common Core commercial by the Common Core people. Check out what they say.
Up until now, it's been pretty hard to tell how well kids are competing in school and how well they're going to do when they get out of school. Is a girl in your neighborhood being taught as much as her friend over in the next one? Is a graduating senior in, say, St. Louis and prepared to get a job as a graduate in Shanghai?
Shanghai, notice.
Now, the answer to both of these questions is no. Because for years, states have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. The standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too.
They match up against international standards too. You got Seattle, Chicago, Shanghai, and Paris.
Still design their own curriculum. With the same rules, everybody can compete on the same kind of staircase.
So do American children need to learn from the same standards as children in Shanghai? Right, where they live under the Communist Party, which has murdered something like 100 million people, not including unborn babies, which when you add that, we're like at 400 million. Do our children need to learn the same stuff as the children under this ruthless dictatorship? I would hope not, but that's what the Common Core people said. We're all going to have the same global standards. Won't that be cute? Now, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is there are solutions. The bad news is it's not going to be easy. As I see it now, we really have 2 options and 2 options only. We either have a massive exodus from the government's indoctrination system, or we get to prepare for that little New World Order that we heard them talking about earlier. We need a Dunkirk rescue operation to get our children out. You know, back during World War II, if you're in a public school, you might not have learned much about this, but the British Army was stuck on the beaches of Dunkirk on the verge of being completely annihilated by Hitler's National Socialists. Well, the British people got on their knees and they prayed, and then they put every resource in their society at the disposal of this rescue operation. Everything that could float went across the English Channel to rescue those boys and bring them back so they could live to fight another day. And I can proudly report that they are not speaking German today on the British Isles. They may be speaking Arabic soon, but we'll save that story for another day. So it worked, right? I mean, it took a lot of effort, it took a lot of sacrifice, but they rescued their soldiers and they ended up not being enslaved by the National Socialists. So we need that kind of mindset today, right? We've got churches all over this country that are sitting empty 6 days a week. Why are there not children in there learning proper education, proper godly curriculum, and so on? So parents, if you can, you got to get your children out. Grandparents, encourage your children to get your children out. Pastors, encourage your congregations, right? You are a shepherd in your flock. You're supposed to be warning your congregation about the wolves that are trying to devour their children, okay? And you can help provide alternatives. There's lots of different ways to do it. You can help set up a school there. I mean, we at Freedom Project, we can actually set up a school for you. It won't cost you anything. Just get some kids, get some laptops and a chaperone, and you'll be good. We also need to ask what is the purpose of education? Why do we even have education? It's so that we can all get a good job and drive a fancy car and retire in Florida. Okay, no, good. All right, everybody's paying attention. Good. No, right? God told us what is the purpose of education. He also told us who should be in charge, right? He said, hand over your children to Caesar as soon as they're old enough to be out of the diapers. No, he didn't say that, right? He says parents should train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he's old, he will not depart from it. You should teach these laws to your children, talking to them when you're sitting in your house, when you're walking by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up, whenever they're not with Caesar. No. And then God tells us what an education should look like. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Okay. Then we see from Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Anybody in a public school, have you heard anything about the Lord lately? Probably not, right? There'd be a federal lawsuit faster than you could say the Lord. Now, what happens when we end up ignorant, when we have fraudulent, counterfeit education? We know from God's word, Hosea 4:6, my people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. Right? In Isaiah, there's people going to captivity for lack of knowledge. So bad things happen when we end up ignorant, right? And that's what's happened in America. We don't know who we are as a people. We don't know our history. We don't know our heritage. We don't know our Constitution. And we don't know our enemies. So we'll talk about those going forward here. Now, Harvard used to be a reasonable university, and they explained very clearly the main end of your life and your studies is to know God. Okay, that's the point of your education. Also in America, we were blessed to be born in a self-governing nation, and therefore we need to know something about government and how to govern ourselves. Otherwise, we won't do very well, will we? So that's another purpose of education in our system. Now, we do homeschooling. You've seen probably some of my kids around. We love homeschooling, and we're in good company, right? All these men here, they were primarily educated at home by their parents. Some of them had a little formal schooling, some of them had a little bit of university, some of them got degrees, but the bulk of their education took place at home with their parents, with their aunts, with their uncles, with their older siblings. Now, lots of fun facts about homeschooling. There's great private schools out there for people who can't do homeschooling. Freedom Project is one option. It's an online school. We just founded a new ministry, Public School Exit, to help liberate children from public school. So we got a lot of different things going on. It's publicschoolexit.com if you want to check it out. Once the cash starts flowing, we're going to start helping with scholarships too, to help liberate children from public schools. We're creating partnerships with Christian schools across the country. It's going to be fun. And now we also need to recognize that they are not going to tolerate this educational freedom for much longer. In fact, they've already told us. In 2015, the dictator-controlled UN Human Rights Council passed a resolution saying that all this private education has got to be monitored and regulated and controlled by the government. We've got to have the same international standards imposed on all of these schools. In New York, they're already coming for the Jews, right? You got to shut down those yeshivas if they won't teach enough of what the government thinks ought to be taught, and Christians will be next, I can guarantee it. Now, just a refresher, they're brainwashing, indoctrinating the children. They're dumbing down the children. I've got one copy left of this book that I co-wrote with the great Dr. Sam Blumenfeld. And, a lot of us patriots, we're like, well, I've got my Second Amendment. I've got my guns. I'm going to fight for my freedom. And, don't get me wrong, I'm all about that too. We need to keep our Second Amendment. But guess what, guys? What good are your guns going to do when your children are the ones who come to take them? None, right? So they don't need your guns. They already have your children, and so you don't really have much of a chance when that's the situation, and that's where we are. Now, Hitler put it this way. He said, when an opponent declares, I will not come over to your side, I just calmly say, your child already belongs to us. You will pass on, but your descendants now stand in the new camp. In a short time, they will know nothing else but this new community. And for the bulk of America's youngsters today, that's where we are. They don't know anything about America except slavery, global warming, gender theory, blah, blah, blah. They don't know anything about the deep state, and we're in big trouble. Right? So we need an exodus from government schools. If you don't have a copy yet, in the back there on the table, there's copies of the special report we did on rescuing our children. It's kind of like a very extended version of this talk that I gave you today. You can get it on DVD also. You can order it in bulk if you want to share it with the elders at your church or whatever. And then I'll just close with a scripture so that we understand that this is much bigger than just an educational battle or anything like that. Ephesians 6:12, God tells us what we're up against. He says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, and against spiritual wickedness in high places. That's what we're dealing with, folks, and it's we got to get busy.